Just let me talk with you about the scenario that Paul finds himself in here. He finds himself in the middle of a conflict between two women in the church. Okay? And if you've never been a part of a church that has a conflict, has experienced a conflict, then you've probably just never been a part of a church. Okay? Or you were just one of those who slipped in the back and weren't aware that often churches have conflicts. What Paul gives us in Philippians chapter 4 is an incredible way and plan to manage conflicts. And that doesn't mean the conflicts go away easily. It doesn't mean the conflicts disperse. It doesn't mean you won't have them. But it does give us a plan for how to handle them. So just take a look with me at this text again in Philippians chapter 4. I was going to have you stand up and read it, but I knew when we got to verses 2, you would run into Euodia and Syntyche, and I would be the one saying those words, all right? So here we go, verse 1. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Let's just talk about that briefly. 3 things we need to know. When there is a conflict, number 1, bring encouragement first. Now, you can apply this. We're going to apply it to the church because that's where it's applied here. But you can apply this in all of your relationships. Where there is a conflict, bring encouragement first. Where there is a conflict, understand the nature of unity. Okay? And you're going to probably gain some insight into that this morning and why we have some of the conflicts we do. And finally, where there is a conflict, recognize the benefits of outside help. Okay? So we're going to see all 3 of those in just 3 verses this morning. Let's talk about that first one if we could. Bring encouragement first. And we want to say, affirm your love, express your joy, and encourage steadfastness. Affirm your love, express your joy, and encourage steadfastness. Let's talk about that briefly. Let's talk about affirming your love. Notice what's highlighted in the text. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my beloved, he says a little later. Both renderings of the word love come from the Greek word agape. Now, we talked about this before. The Greek word agape is a unique word that the Greeks, the New Testament writers, developed to communicate the sacrificial love that Christ had for the church. Because there really had been nothing in the history of mankind expressed like that. A perfect man, God in the flesh, coming to die for those who were sinners and his enemies. So often, even Jesus said, someone will die for a friend, but will someone die for their enemies? This is the truth that we discover. This is the word behind agape. And it's the word here that is described as the one whom I love, Paul says, to those in the church of Philippi. We're going to try it? You know what it's like? When I was a campus pastor at a college, I had a student who did impressions. By the way, your executive pastor, Pastor Scott, does impressions too. But this particular student did an impression of me and had my hand motions down and everything. And I came home and showed Kim the tape, and she said, you know, what's the big deal? That's you. I said, that's not me. Some student imitating me. And she said, wow, he's really good. And the first time I got up to preach to all of those students again, I felt like I was like tied. That's kind of how I just felt when I had to pick up that mic. That's not me, so I'm glad to be back here again. Okay, here we go. The one whom I long for, my beloved, Paul says. And it's a great reminder that he's talking very specifically about his care and his love for them. Now, the word agape occurs a lot of times in the New Testament, but here's one that doesn't. The word long for. It's only here. It's only here. Now, think about this for a second. Paul wrote to multiple churches. He wrote letters to multiple churches. He ministered in multiple churches. And yet only with the church of Philippi did he say, I long for you. I am emotionally connected, Paul says, to this church. Now just think about that for a second. Paul's saying, you guys are special. You're different than the other churches. You mean something more deeply to me. I can understand that because for some reason over the course of the last month, God has ordained for me to be traveling a little bit more than I normally do. And every time I travel someplace, I am reminded that this is the church that I love, right? That so much of what I've learned and discovered in my time of ministry has been learned here with you guys. And you might have thought that your story of courage, your story of grace, your story of forgiveness, that we as a church embraced or saw, wherever you fall in that category, is only known to this church. It isn't. It isn't. A week ago, 3 weeks ago, I was in California sharing some of your stories. For some reason, spontaneously, God arranged for me to go to Argentina this past week. And I just got in about 24 hours ago, so if I fall asleep somewhere in the message, wake me up, all right? But there I was, sitting at a table, having dinner, with communicating to missionaries through a translator some of your stories, right? And I was sitting there thinking, I wouldn't have anything to say. I'd have the Bible, but I wouldn't have the reality of the story behind it if it wouldn't be for the people who make up Fellowship Bible Church. I know that, Kim and I have known your love, so I'm encouraged by that. I trust you understand that you are the church I long for, right? Even when I'm away, I'm saying, man, I cannot wait to get home. Why? Because there is, as Paul says with the church of Philippi, some kind of relationship that ensues when you are engaging the word with people who are growing and learning, and even when they're struggling and failing, you're still connected to them in some way. This is the word he uses here. He says, you are the people I long for. I love that. He's going to talk to them about the fact that they have a conflict. Now, just think about this for a second. But before he ever does that, his first thought is, hey, I want to encourage you. Okay, verse 1. I know we got a conflict. I'm going to get there, but I just want to tell you, I love you and I long for you. Okay? So affirm your love. First of all, here's the second idea. Express your joy. He says, you are my joy and my crown. You are my joy and my crown. Now, when was the last time you thought about having to talk to someone who's and your first thought was, this is such a joy, okay? Any takers on that? Like, do you, because I'm not there. I don't actually enjoy wading into a conflict. Now, I know some are kind of gifted that way, and they kind of say, I smell the conflict, let's go, okay? But I'm not, right? I go, I smell the conflict, let's go that way, all right? But here's the point. Paul is going to get to the conflict, but before he gets to the conflict, he says, you are my joy. But he uses even a cooler word. He uses the word, you are my crown. This is a Greek word that communicates that one day we will receive crowns in heaven. Just let that thought settle in. Paul is saying, the people in the church of Philippi are the crowns that I receive in heaven. That's pretty cool. That means that your investment, youth leader in the teens, your investment, Awana leader in the children, your investment, women in the Bible study, your investment, men in a circle around a table or in our men's Bible study, your investment in others is in some way a crown. You may have never thought about it that way. Also, that puts perspective, doesn't it, on the conflict he's got to talk about. He's thinking about the conflict, but he's saying, hey, wait a second. Before I get to the conflict, I just want to remember that these people are my crown. They are my reward in heaven in some way. So notice this, he expressed your joy. Here's the final one, if you would, just note it with me. Encourage steadfastness. Stand firm thus in the Lord. He uses a word it's kind of a military term. He's using a word that says, listen, I just want to encourage you, stay steadfast, don't get rattled by the conflict, okay? Even though there's a conflict in your midst, don't get rattled by it. Stand firm in the Lord. 3 things he does. Affirm your love, express your joy, encourage steadfastness. And that brings us to the heart of the conflict. First thing I think we need to understand, at least for church, and probably in our marriages, and probably in almost all of our relationships, you can understand, if you understand the nature of unity, you'll understand the conflict. So often we think that unity is us just agreeing on something. But I think the greater struggle with unity in churches is this, that we'll need to agree upon what we can disagree on, okay? That sounds a little complicated, but it isn't really. We're going to need to agree upon what we can disagree on. When Dr. Nicholas Ellen was here doing the marriage boot camp, he taught us 4 words, okay? And I was just sitting there thinking, man, these 4 words are really good for marriage, but they're also really, really good for understanding how church conflicts work. If we could only understand what we're allowed to disagree upon, then we would understand that we can have unity even though we don't necessarily agree with everybody in the same room. Understand the nature of unity. So we're going to talk through those 4 words, and I'm going to use these baskets behind me to explain those 4 words. Before we get there, though, just let me read to you what Melech says. He says, if the women could not resolve the problem themselves, they were to secure a mediator. Apparently, the dispute was not moral, and neither woman was guilty of theological heresy. How do we know that? Because when it's a moral issue, Paul calls them out, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, with the man who's sinning with his mother-in-law. Or a theological issue, he calls them out, like Peter in Galatians chapter 2 on a belief issue. In both cases, Paul doesn't have a problem addressing them. So we would understand that this issue must not be a theological issue or a moral issue. If Paul so urged the erring one to submit to the Lord and the church, this was a true disagreement, and a third party could help resolve it. Okay, now with that in mind, let me introduce you to these 4 words, okay? Here they are: preference, wisdom, conscience, morality. And I want these baskets to represent them as we define them, because you're going to see how the conflict happens. I'm indebted to Nicholas for the words and for portions of the definitions, but I just kept wrestling with these words, thinking, man, if we really understood, we have at this stage for Fellowship Bible Church, we've said it before, we have an incredibly unified church. But not that there aren't differences, but there is unity. But if we really understood these words, we could go on practicing unity for a significant period of time. Here they are. When disagreements exist, understand these 4 words: preference. A preference is neither right or wrong, just the way a person prefers things to be. Okay? A preference is neither right or wrong, just the way a person prefers things to be. Now, there's a reason that we prefer things to be a certain way, and it has to do, at least from my perspective, let me simplify it. It has to do with our 5 senses, okay? Now just think about this for a moment. Shout out the senses we have. What do we have? Sense of sight, eyes. Sense of smell. Yes, sense of smell. Something else? Taste. Okay, something else? Hearing and touching, feeling. Hey, great. Man, you should pass that test, Ryan, in science class coming up. You know them all, okay? Here's the thing. We have 5 senses. Now just think about this for a second. Recent discoveries have said that we have the ability, our nose has the ability with 400 sensors to differentiate 1 trillion different odors. Okay? You say, yeah, I know. Some of those exist in my house from time to time, okay? 1 trillion different odors. You have 10,000 taste buds. You can million variants of colors, and you can hear 330,000 frequencies, okay? That's a lot of statistical information, and that tells us that we're all going to have different preferences, right? I mean, I love the 1980s. I'd still be dressing like I was in them if Kim wouldn't occasionally say, you need to send that thing to the Goodwill, okay? I love the 80s. I love the music of the 80s. I love almost everything from the 80s, okay? The point is this, that I have certain preferences that someone who was born after 1980 can't even possibly have, right? We all have preferences. And if you think about that for a second, you're going to understand that it's easy for us to start to feel like our preferences are really, really important. In fact, let me see if I can communicate it another way. Sometimes those preferences, because they happen with our senses in a physical world, get attached to spiritual dynamics. That's why from time to time, when I would quote from a song, I would see a couple of our older women actually tear up just reading the words from the song. And I would say, why do you tear up? And they would say something like, I was saved when I heard that song, okay? Right? The song itself, the hearing of the song, even just the hearing of the words, brings back a spiritual moment, okay? Sometimes it doesn't have to be that. Sometimes it's just like maybe the smell of a campfire will remind you of a decision you made at camp or a conversation you had that was really insightful with someone about something spiritual. The very element of our senses can get attached to something spiritual in such a way that we struggle to detach it from something spiritual. And you know what just happened? Suddenly that preference does feel right or wrong to you, right? It feels like it's wrong to have something else, or it feels like it's wrong to adjust something that's just a preference. Because to you, that preference has now been attached to something spiritual. I just want to remind you, a preference is neither right nor wrong. Notice how Paul talks about it in verse 16 of Romans chapter 12. He says, be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Here it comes. Do not be wise in your own. In the Greek language, there's a blank there. There isn't a word there. It just says, do not be wise in your. And the translators added the word opinion or preference, some have added, because they're saying, listen, it's just saying whatever you have that isn't that important, don't be wise and insist it's the only way. Because in the end, it's only a preference. A preference. Neither right nor wrong, just the way a person prefers things to be. Wisdom. Seeking to determine what is good, better, or best in a given situation. I love that. Wisdom is seeking to determine what is good, better, and best in a given situation. Now, if you're tracking with me, you can immediately begin to see conflicts, okay? I just had a conversation this morning with my son about an issue of wisdom, right? He was telling me something he was going to participate in on April Fool's Day. I was telling him, I don't think that's a very good idea, okay? Right? Why? Because I'm a little older, he's a little younger, wisdom looks different, right? So I did say, are you prepared for the consequences of that decision? What consequences? Well, these consequences might happen. And if this doesn't go well, I'm going to tell you some consequences I'm going to give you, okay? Are you prepared for those consequences, right? Now listen, this is all a discussion of wisdom. In the end, I had to say, because it's a discussion of wisdom, and because I was going to preach on it this morning, I actually had to say to him, listen, it's your decision. It's your decision. Even though I think it might cost you something, right? Wisdom is seeking to determine what is good, better, or best in a given situation, and that's why Proverbs always talks about it like that. A wise son hears his father's instruction. Ooh, that's a good one. I should have brought that earlier. But a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. Everybody's going to want to know what happens next week. We'll see. Okay. By insolence comes nothing but strife, but with those who take advice is wisdom. The wisdom of the prudent is to discern his way, but the folly of the fools is deceiving. Here's the idea. Proverbs, you may have heard it said before, is not a book of promises, it's a book of Proverbs. It's not called the book of promises. It's called the book of Proverbs, which means that if you do this 9 times out of 10, this is what's going to happen. It's a statement of wisdom, okay? But you got to know that when we talk about wisdom, we will probably find a distinction between the older generation and the younger generation. Are you with me in that? Okay. Sometimes an older generation will say, I don't think that's a good idea, and the younger generation will say, why? Right? There's 2 ways the Bible tells us we can learn wisdom. One is by experience, okay? We can learn it through experience, and that's why sometimes folks who are a little older look back and say, I wouldn't do that if I were you because this is what happened to me, and these were the consequences. Sometimes it goes the other way, and a younger person says, but I don't really think that's going to happen to me because you don't really know the culture that I live in. And so we find all of that working in the realm of wisdom. Here's what I want to remind you. You and I will have differences in this, in what we assume to be good, better, or best in any situation. By the way, moms and dads, same things happen at home, right? You and I have different opinions in what we think is the wisest use of how our children do everything from use their time to their money. That's wisdom. We have to acknowledge this is an area we actually can disagree upon. Here's the 3rd area, conscience. Conscience is neither right or wrong. Whoa, you say, wait a minute. It's my conscience, okay? Just understand, we're talking about in a group or a corporate group. A conscience is neither right or wrong, but believed to be so by personal conviction. Therefore, one person can think one thing in their relationship with the Lord, and another can think another thing in their relationship with the Lord, and both can be right. You say, no, that's not possible. Look at Romans chapter 14. There, Paul says, one person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Here's how it worked. In biblical times, they had a lot of idolatry going on. And if you've never seen that happen physically, then you can't really appreciate and understand what it's like to watch food being offered to an idol. When we grew up, when I was in seminary in California, there was this really beautiful Asian building down the street, and my mother-in-law, when she came out to visit us, said, hey, after church, why don't we go there to eat? And I said, because that's a Buddhist temple. They will have food, but it's been offered to idols, okay? And I remember standing at the back for a missions project, standing at the back of the Buddhist temple and watching people walk up, huge Buddha in the center, 2 on either side, walk up and place food, vegetables, in the offering plates in front of the idols. Okay. You need to understand that for those who had been saved out of idolatry, For them, it felt really wrong. It bothered their conscience to eat the food offered to idols. But for those who had never been saved out of it, they never made an offering to an idol, and therefore, to them, it was just eating food. Okay. You say, well, how can both be right? Look at verse 4. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. In other words, they have a personal conviction. Don't downplay their personal conviction. But the other doesn't have that same personal conviction. Don't insist that they must have your own personal conviction. Because we would say that the conscience is working often, or conviction, those personal convictions are working on things that may not necessarily be spoken of in the Word of God, which we're going to define as morality in a second, okay? So when I use the word conscience, I'm speaking of things that aren't necessarily spoken of in the Bible, but God's spoken to you about something, and you really don't want to change that. I remember when I first came to fellowship, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far, far away, okay, that in the Q&A session prior to them voting on me, there was a man in the front row, an older man who stood up and he said to me, Pastor, you're not speaking from the translation of the Bible I'm speaking from. And I remember thinking, like, I'm a young kid, I don't know much at that stage, but I knew this, that when he held up his Bible and said, this is the only Bible I've ever owned, and I truly believe God speaks through it, that I wasn't about to ask him to use the translation that I was using. But I wasn't going to change the translation that I was using, but I wanted to encourage him to use the one he was using. My father, before he was saved, had some vices that he would tell you about if he were still living, because he told people about them without difficulty. One of those was gambling. Okay? So I grew up in a house that didn't have any playing cards. Listen, the Bible says nothing about playing cards, nothing. Okay? But I remember that my dad, because he had so associated his gambling problems with a lifestyle that he had left, he didn't engage with it. Okay? Some of you may have heard me tell the story before. My dad actually had the chance to, in a long time ago, he had a first cousin who actually played cards with Al Capone. Okay? Now, if you'd played cards with Al Capone, that would be a problem, right? You might actually say, maybe I shouldn't be playing cards because I might have a conviction about that because of all the other things that are associated with it. Kim's family didn't have that conviction, which is why now when I get together to play cards with them, I always lose, right? Because they grew up playing, but I didn't, see? Here's the point. That's just a conscience issue. It was a conscience issue for my father, but it doesn't need to be for me, right? Okay. There's your picture, conscience. Now, we're going to explain how those work in just a second. But I always like to remind people that your conscience can be wrong, by the way. When you're overly confident in it, it can be wrong. In two occasions, it's when we talk about the conscience isn't right or wrong, we're saying that it's defined by what you personally have as a conviction. But even your personal conviction could actually be wrong on two occurrences. One, it could be weak in 1 Corinthians 8:7. That's why Paul says, however, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Here's the second one. Your conscience can be seared. A searing happens when something is pressed up against either friction or heat, and it sears. You can almost hear it, right? It goes sears, just like that. It burns it in such a way that it's dead. This is a great challenge. That sometimes when our conscience rubs up against truth, but we do not respond to it, we can sear our consciences. So just by way of reminder, don't think I can always trust what I feel. No, you can't always trust what you feel. It could be weak or it could be seared. Here's your fourth word. We're going to call this morality. Obeying or disobeying what God has specifically commanded in His Word. It's a great word, morality. Obeying or disobeying what God has specifically commanded in His Word. I've mentioned this to you before, but I want you to think that most of the New Testament verb forms come in the indicative or the imperative. The indicative is a statement of fact. That means it is something you and I believe. We're not going to change it, okay? The imperative is a command. It's something we're supposed to do. We either got a choice. We can obey or disobey. When you realize that the Bible is full of truths that are to be believed and commands that are to be obeyed, okay, then you understand that these things don't change, right? Now, here's the thing. 3 of those categories are categories that we can disagree upon, here, and here. This is the one we can't disagree upon. You with me? Because this is the one that comes directly from the Bible. It's not a personal conviction that isn't listed in the Bible. It's directly from the Bible. Now watch what happens when you all of a sudden take a preference and say it's not a preference. It's like an issue of right or wrong to me, okay? You're going to have a debate. Why? Because somebody sees this as a preference, but you see it as right or wrong. The most important thing you can remember about these words is that the basket should remain separate, only so that you can drop in the decision that you're trying to make. You're saying, okay, I think that's a wisdom decision. But if someone says this has got to be the best way, it's going to be the best way, no other way should happen, then they're going to make this a right or wrong decision, and you're going to have a conflict. Okay? But what if they can learn to say, hey, I understand that this is good, better, or best, and I think my idea is best, but your idea is good, and so it's still got to remain a wisdom decision. It doesn't mean that you're not going to disagree, but it does mean that you're not going to attach to it some kind of spiritual decision. Let me show you something else that happens. When someone says, well, that is my personal conviction, and you say to them, where do you find that in the Bible? I don't know where it's in the Bible. I'm sure it's in there somewhere, okay? But I know it's a personal conviction. Okay? Fine, you can have a personal conviction, but you can't call that personal conviction everybody else's personal conviction, or you've made it an issue of morality. As I've been thinking about this over the course of the last couple weeks, and I've been thinking about the message that was coming up in Philippians 4, I don't want to overly generalize, but I want to show you something that I think can be understood. In my parents' generation, and maybe even some of your parents' generations, things work like this. Almost everything was an issue of morality, okay? Whether it was wisdom, whether it was conscience, whether it was preference. Why else do you think churches divide and split over the color of the carpet? You can't find the color of the carpet anywhere in morality, okay? But the preference or the wisdom is so strong that all of a sudden they make it a right or wrong issue. That's the past generation. Again, I want to be sensitive to overgeneralize. But you know what I think happens to this generation? Almost everything is an issue of preference. Feel free to do what you want to do. That's not how I believe. Now, I understand that we cannot expect an unbelieving world or nation or society to attain to the issues of morality that we attain to. But when all of a sudden the church or churches who are supposed to believe the Bible are suddenly seeing this issue as a preference, that is a problem, right? It's got to be a problem. Because these are the things that the Bible specifically says are beliefs or are behaviors that they attach commands to that we ought to do. You say, well, give me one as an example. Sure, flee sexual immorality. Right? That when it comes to any kind of sexual involvement outside of the husband and wife in the marriage, the Bible's really clear on that. You can look at 1 Corinthians 5. It's not going to 6. It's not going to disagree. Okay? Any kind of sexual activity outside of the Bible is an issue of morality, outside of the husband and wife relationship in the marriage. But when we all of a sudden say, no, that's just a preference, we are moving away from the truths that the Bible teaches. You say, well, how does it work if that's the command? How does it work if it's a belief? Sure. Let me give you one. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. It's very specific, definitive. You can only come to heaven through Christ. But if we say, well, that's just a preference, we've changed the belief system, see? You can get there any way you want as long as you're trying your best. That's not the belief system of the Bible. So here's what I want you to see. That's kind of how the society we're living in operates. What we have to be careful of is that as Christians, we don't see all morality as issues of preference, but in the same sense, we have to become very wise about seeing our preferences as preferences, wisdom as wisdom, conscience as conscience, personal convictions as personal convictions, and finally, the things that the Bible is definitive on, black and white, as issues that we cannot change on and that we must agree upon. By the way, it's great that we have the Bible because you can look at the black words on the white page and understand them in that way. You say, well, wait a minute, Phil. On those issues of morality, let's say I'm speaking to some who may be hearing this for the first time. You guys don't do some of the laws in the Old Testament, right? I mean, I don't see anybody sacrificing any animals down front here, right? And that's because the New Testament speaks of a new covenant, a new relationship with Christ that ensues. But it doesn't, you don't read the New Testament and see nothing about commands. You still find the commands in the New Testament. Some of them, not all of them that you saw in the Old. So here's the idea. Learn when you have a conflict to say, is this a preference? Is this wisdom? Is it conscience? Is it morality? And you'll find that if you can drop them in the right basket, you'll find that you can agree to disagree on certain things, but you'll agree to agree on the things that really matter. Let me give you one last one. Those are the 4 words. Here's your last idea. Recognize the benefits of outside help. Here it is briefly in Philippians chapter 4. Recognize the benefits of outside help. Acknowledge the problem, don't take sides, realize much is at stake. You say, you found all of that in the text? Just watch. It's pretty cool. The Bible does this. He says, I entreat Euodia and Syntyche to agree in the Lord. He calls these people out by name. He gives specifics. He's acknowledging there's a problem. He isn't saying, I hear there's a problem in your church, okay? He's very specific about what the problem is. The problem exists between 2 women in the church. He also does something else there. Your translation renders it, yes, I ask you also, true companion, or faithful servant. It actually is the Greek word souzagos. It actually could be a person's name. We don't know that for sure, or maybe it's the name of a person who actually is just known as a faithful and true companion. Whatever it is, there's a good chance, some Bible scholars think, that this person, true companion, was actually called out by name, souzagos. So he's saying, I entreat Euodia and Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I also ask you, souzagos, to help these women who have labored side by side. He acknowledges the problem, and he actually provides specific outside help. Notice that Paul does not, as some pastors do, regard matters such as this as private, to be settled outside the church, lest anyone be disturbed. No, in Paul's view, this is precisely the nature and function of the congregation as a partnership. I love that. There are certain issues that ought to be public in the church to be dealt with. Here's your second idea. Notice that you're not to take sides. Notice what Paul does with this language. This is so important. He says, I entreat you, Euodia, and I entreat you, Syntyche. Now, I could have said, I entreat you, Euodia and Syntyche, but in the Greek language, that would have put entreat next to Euodia, but not next to Syntyche. You say, would that have been a problem? Yes, that would have been a problem. It would have meant that the problem existed with Euodia, not Syntyche. See? Instead, Paul uses both verbs to say, I entreat you and entreat you. He's not taking sides in where the fault is, but secondly, look at verse 3. You also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me. He's not saying one is better than the other in their service either. Paul's not taking sides. He's trying, you can picture it, to get the problem resolved, probably looking at it this way, not looking at it as a personality thing. Then he says this in Philippians 1:27, with one mind striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. I love that. This language sounds exactly like what's going on in Philippians 4. Paul is saying, listen, these women were striving. They served hard. They served faithfully. They were side by side for the faith and for the gospel. Notice with me finally this last idea. Realize much is at stake. He says, who have labored side by side with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. It's almost like Paul is saying to them, listen, there is a lot at stake. The ability of the gospel to go forward is tied to the ability for the church to be unified. The ability for faith to exist and be passed on. If you can't get unified in the church, there's a really good possibility you're not going to be sending people out to share the gospel with anybody else. You can't even figure it out yourself. Here's the thing. There is much at stake when there is disunity. I mentioned to you, I had this chance to share with this mission with a couple hundred missionaries spontaneously down in Argentina. And when I was there, I was talking through some of this material, but the importance of unity. And I remember coming to the end of the discussion and saying to them, you know, I need to tell you why this is so important. It's important because having read a missionologist a few years ago who took statistics of where Christian faith is moving, that is where people are coming to faith in Christ and where they're not, said that by the year 2050,
2050, that's like just about 30 years away, nearly all of Christianity will be south of the equator. Just understand that for a second. I remember reading that statement and saying, that's crazy. He had maps at the beginning. I went back to look at the maps at the beginning of the book. I couldn't find North America. Most of Christianity, by 2050, even when we're trying to do our job up here, is going to move south of the equator, South America and Africa. And I said to them, listen, you guys have to have it together because you become the sending continents of the next generation. I'm all for the fact that we should be sending missionaries, and we do, but I understand that the volume of missionaries are going to come from South America and Africa in the years that are ahead. This is why Paul says, listen, you must have unity, because there is a lot at stake if the church does not have unity. Here's a great question for you this morning. Which one of these do you take as too important? Preference, wisdom, conscience, we should all take morality as important. Which one of those do you need the most help on not putting in the other basket? Okay? Just take a moment and think about that as I close in prayer.